Welcome to Living Dialogues. I'm Duncan Campbell, and with me for this particular discussion and dialogue, I'm really delighted to have
Saffron Rossi, editor of the Joseph Campbell book on Goddesses, Mysteries of the Feminine Divine. The issues are timeless. Enjoy this example of co-creative dialogue, sharing personal stories, as we together co-create an evolutionary, wise, and compassionate culture needed in these times. From time immemorial, beginning with indigenous councils and ancient wisdom traditions, through the work of Western visionaries such as Plato, Galileo, and quantum physicist David Bohm, mutually participatory dialogue has been seen as the key to evolving and transforming consciousness, evoking a flow of meaning, a dia flow of logos, meaning, beyond what any one individual can bring through alone. So join us now, as together with you, the active, deep listener, we evoke and engage in living dialogues. Good morning, and I have to say, to me, the spring always a time for great celebration, and it's a lead-in to the special program we have today with Saffron Rossi, R-O-S-S-I, who has edited this most amazing book by Joseph Campbell. It is his writings that are taken from his work on the goddess and collected together for the first time here. Many of them 15 to 20 years after he delivered them. He was a real forerunner of the need in our culture here in America, but also worldwide, to bring back into balance the great feminine and masculine energies. We have been, as many tribal peoples and other people have observed, in a 4,000 to 6,000 year kind of patriarchy, in which the masculine has been out of balance with the feminine, and from many perspectives, including our own here on Living Dialogues, it's time and necessary to bring them together in a kind of sacred marriage. So, without further ado, I want to introduce Saffron Rossi. Saffron, how are you?
I'm well, thank you, Duncan.
What I'd like to invite you to do to begin with is give us a curriculum vitae version of yourself, being a teacher and a graduate of Pacifica Graduate School. And then I'm going to ask you a lead-in question.
Great. Yes, so I am associate core faculty at Pacifica Graduate Institute in the depth psychology program that focuses on Jungian and archetypal studies. And I'm also the curator of collections at Opus Archives, which, among a number of other collections, has the Joseph Campbell manuscript collection in his personal library. And I've been working at the archives. This is going to be my 8th year. So I've spent a lot of time down in the vault, so to speak, with the legacy of Campbell and Maria Gimbutas and a number of other remarkable individuals. So that's the short CV, and this book, Goddesses, based on Joseph Campbell's lectures that he had given on goddess mythologies, has been the main project that I had been working on for the last couple of years, and it's wonderful to be able to finally share it with others.
Well, it's wonderful. I love this metaphor that just came out spontaneously, that you were down in the vaults with the work of Joseph Campbell and Maria Gimbutas, because there is this sense, in the goddess of the descent journey, that the goddess in many ways is regarded in different cultures as the mistress, you might say, of the underworld and the unconscious, and that aspect that's different from the Apollo energy of the god of the sun and the visible world. So the depth of understanding and wisdom of the feminine principle has often been portrayed in that kind of journey into the depth consciousness, and you yourself are bringing together Jungian depth consciousness as well as your deep historical knowledge. It's one of the specialties of Pacifica Graduate School out there in Santa Barbara. And I have to say, that this is such a great work. In the beginning of it, there's a little note from the Joseph Campbell Foundation with our mutual friend Bob Walter, where he notes that basically, I should probably just mention it in his words, that at his death in 1987, Joseph Campbell left a significant body of published work that explored his lifelong passion, the complex of universal myths and symbols that he called, quote, mankind's one great story, close quote. He also left, however, a large volume of unreleased work, uncollected articles, notes, letters, and diaries, as well as audio and videotaped recorded lectures. And the Joseph Campbell Foundation, founded in 1990, 3 years after Campbell's death, to preserve, protect, and perpetuate his work, has undertaken to create a digital archive of his papers and recordings. And that will be published as the collected works of Joseph Campbell. And this is going to be part of them. And what I'd like to do here is two questions to start. Then one is, if you're looking back suddenly on your childhood, Saffron, do you see a little incident that immediately comes to your mind, out of the unconscious perhaps, that you look back on and you see as a harbinger of your life, work, and passion?
Well, the first image that comes to mind is, sitting on the floor in my family's living room and looking at the books on the shelves that my mother and father, had collected and were interested in. And one that always sticks out in my mind was a very large black-bound book with a gold print down the spine, and it was Thus Spake Zarathustra. And near it was Jung, and then, of course, there was Campbell. And so for me, I was raised in a family that was really interested in these stories of transformation, these ancient stories that we could learn how to relate to in a new way, in the sense of in the present moment, the present life, and learn to discern meaning through these stories. And so that was always present for me growing up. So I think, that my fate was pretty clear, and I didn't wrestle with it too hard, so I just sort of went with the flow.
It's a beautiful story, because I can say the same. I could tell a little story of my own, calling, and it had to do with when I was 6, feeling just the sense of mystery and the awe and wonder of the universe, and having a sense that the reason I was here on the planet, we might say today in an incarnation, was to actually experience that as deeply as I could, and to share that experience and help facilitate it for others. So it was like a vocation or a calling, but it didn't have a particular manifestation until I continued to grow up. But that's my first conscious memory. It's very similar, because I recall that when I first encountered Joseph Campbell, there was an immediate sense of recognition and intimacy with his work. I think the first one I came across, decades ago, was The Hero with a Thousand Faces, and the title itself really went right into my consciousness, and it was just an invitation I couldn't refuse. And then I read The Masks of God and any number of other books and writings by Campbell, including those that were put together by Bob Walter, as we talked about. And I just saw them in my library just yesterday, and this is going to take a treasured place next to it, because I have to say that what you have brought forth here in this collection called Goddesses, Mysteries of the Feminine Divine, I have found things in this book that I have not found elsewhere in Campbell, and it gives a wonderful summary, if you will, or an insight with new material into his whole corpus, you might say, his whole life work, and you brought it together with such tremendous skill. I first want to just honor you for having brought this together in such a successful way. And so I'm just going to say, many of the listeners are familiar with Campbell, and some may not be, but this is a not-to-be-missed book. It's just the right time. And so let's talk about the timing of this. You and I have spoken offline, as it were, about what we think about the timing and why this is finally coming out in a time of great crisis now of the patriarchy and the 1% and the 99% and all of the things that we're seeing, including the latest Ukrainian crisis, and can all be lensed through the mythological and historical viewpoint that is so well expressed here in so many ways by Campbell. So what I'm going to ask you to do is give us a little background that you talked with me about before of how Bob Walters was thinking earlier about having this book come forth, and it didn't a couple of times for whatever reason, but that Campbell was on this issue prophetically even in the 80s before he died.
Sure. Yes. Bob Walter is, really a remarkable man, and he had been Campbell's editor while Campbell was working on the Historical Atlas of World Mythology back in the 80s. And so Bob was very close with Campbell and ended up finishing that project because Campbell died before it was done. So Bob had spent a good deal of time being able to understand, as you read in that note of his that's in the book, that there was just a treasure trove of material that needed to come forth over time, even after Campbell had already passed away. So the story regarding a book based on Campbell's ideas on goddess mythologies, the initial attempt had been while he was alive, and then the second attempt shortly after his death by a woman that had been a student of his. And for various reasons, the manuscript just didn't come to a fruition or a form that seemed to work. And then I was approached by Bob and given the history of all of this, and basically a couple of boxes of material, most of which were audio cassette tapes from lectures that Campbell had given at Esalen or at La Casa de Maria here in Santa Barbara or at the Theater of the Open Eye in New York City, an alumni lecture he gave at Sarah Lawrence. So this amazing collection of his presentations, and through a long, immersive process of listening to his lectures on a little tape player and headphones, and then going through various documents, some of the early drafts of the book as it had kind of come about, I began to track what I understood as being the organic structure of Campbell's understanding of the way goddess mythologies unfolded through time, and how certain symbols and themes, and we could say the psychological and spiritual significance, remained consistent even through huge amounts of time passing through and various cultures and their stories. And having identified that authentic structure, which was Campbell's own, beginning to then be able to create this manuscript itself, which is, of course, the book. So it was a profound process, because I was very clear going into it that, in a way, I was a vessel for Campbell's own voice, that these were his ideas, this had been his work, and my job was to be able to kind of be filled by the information and give it a form that people would be able to access. But the focus on the authenticity of his structure, let alone the authenticity of his voice, was always absolutely primary.
Well, it's just so interesting to hear how you spontaneously talk in these terms, Saffron, because, as Jung said, all transformation goes through the body of the feminine. And here you're talking about the seed insights of Campbell and how you allowed yourself to be a vessel and worked with it and co-created this brilliant work and brought it to form that people could actually access from those boxes of tapes that you listened to and already really not organized material. And I loved how you talked about how you saw and felt deeply in your femininity the organic structure of the work coming together, a kind of shamanic dot connecting that comes out of the receptive consciousness that we all have. If we're out there too much, male or female, into our function and our doing, and not enough deeply grounded into our organic being, we just put forth ideology rather than mythology. And so I just want to say here, and again, so much appreciation of how you've spoken about this and how you brought it forth, that the introduction that you start the book with was written by Campbell and first published in Parabola magazine back in 1980. And in it he says that in the art of the Old Stone Age, from the period of the painted Paleolithic caves of southern France and northern Spain, about 30,000 to 10,000 BC, the female is represented in those now well-known little Venus figurines as simply naked. Her body itself is her magic. It both invokes the male and is the vessel of all human life. Woman's magic is thus primary and of nature. The male, in contrast, is always represented in a role of some kind, performing a function, doing something. And even today, as we address and regard the woman, we do so in terms of her beauty, but the male in terms of what he can do, what he has done, what his job is. Close quote. And so we see that in every one of us, we have the feminine aspect of being, and just for purposes of describing the interaction in a balanced way, and the masculine function of the seed or project or doing. And so you've brought them together very, very beautifully in this book, and we want to now go into the evolution of the goddess from that time in the Paleolithic through the Neolithic, which Maria Gimbutas wrote about so beautifully and is represented also and acknowledged in this book by Campbell. Joe Campbell used to say that a true myth, as opposed to a mythology, as opposed to a theology, is always transparent to the transcendent, meaning it allows us to contact the great mystery that we are and that all of creation is. And we've talked here about the sense of organic and the sense of pure and the sense of living energy that you can connect with. So this is, in a sense, a sacred time. Sunday, named after the energy of the sun. It's a time in our tradition in the West to rest from our labors and allow ourselves to be receptive and take in the depth of our own being and learn from it. And so, Saffron, I would like to cover 2 or 3 points. And one is to lead into the fact the recent dialogue I did with Stanislav Grof here, February, available in our archives. He said that Campbell regretted that he only came into contact with Maria Gimbutas and her wonderful work later in life, but he certainly made up for lost time, and much of it is representative of the inspiration he got from Maria Gimbutas and her work on the Neolithic period and her book, The Language of the Goddess. He even wrote the introduction to that before he died in 1987. And that was published in 1989. So 2 points that I'd like you to just take off on, Saffron. The first is the evolution in the Neolithic period, which would be 10,000 or so BC and the beginning of agriculture, and how the primacy of the living universe and the all-encompassing goddess energy was deeply held in the settled agricultural communities and their mythology, and then how that shifted into male-dominated gods around 3500 BC and what we now know as the patriarchy. And in that context, we could talk about the shift that happens from the Iliad to the Odyssey. And I just say all that now because we just have a few minutes left, and I invite you to take the ball and run with it.
Okay, so 7,000 years of history in a few minutes.
Well, 5 or 6 minutes, I know, but I just want to highlight for people the richness of this book and what they're going to discover. It's a treasure trove.
Yes, okay. So what we find through Maria Gimbutas' work, and she was a Lithuanian archaeologist who spent most of her career at UCLA, was her work in the Neolithic time period of southeastern Europe, which she refers to as Old Europe. And we go into detail in the book about this. And as you mentioned, Gimbutas' book, Language of the Goddess, amazing resources for people that are interested in understanding some of the oldest strata of mythological ideas and images that we have. So her understanding, and Campbell was completely on board with it as well, based on all of his studies. He could see the basal structure that she had identified in the development of mythology and civilization and culture, is that during the Neolithic era of Old Europe, roughly 7,500 to 3,500 BCE, there were cultures that honored the divine feminine alongside the divine masculine, and that's my language. But what we see is this balancing of the both feminine energy, which is that of the creative, as well as the masculine energy, which is that of the seed, as you had said yourself. And this has been excavated and come to be understood through the thousands upon thousands of figurines that have been found during many excavations that Gimbutas and her colleagues, were doing in the 60s and 70s. So in the book, the argument unfolds in a much more cohesive way. But by looking at the images of these goddess figurines, looking at the burial formations that this culture had done, which indicated men and women were buried side by side rather than one being preferenced over another, on the symbolic structure, as well as on the pottery and the various tools that were found, also the structure of the towns, which didn't have fortifications. All of these various pieces were what allowed Gimbutas to start to understand this culture that, again, reverenced a goddess or god.
Yes, Saffron. And so one of the things I think we want to talk about now is the fact that when the patriarchal gods took over, for instance, under Hammurabi, and that happened when these herding and sheep herding cultures came in and took over from the goddess, the god Marduk was celebrated in Babylon, and in the great myth there, he mercilessly smashed the skull of the goddess Tiamat and tore her apart, and then he shaped man to serve the male gods so that they should be free to repose at ease. And I'm going to read this one paragraph which reminded me immediately as I read it of what's happening now in our Gilded Age here in Wall Street and the other elites that are continuing to dominate and actually take apart the culture with the progressive inequality and paying no attention to climate change and the body of the earth on which we are all dependent. The two great crises of our time. I personally feel we're in the death spiral of the patriarchy now for this reason. Now listen to this. This is from like 5,000 plus years ago. How interesting, says Campbell. In the older view, the goddess universe was alive, herself organically the earth, the horizon, and the heavens. Now, in this way, and Marduk's supremacy, she is dead, and the universe is not an organism, but a building, with gods at rest in it in luxury, not as personifications of the energies in their manners of operation, but as luxury tenants requiring service. And man, humans, accordingly, are not children born to flower in the knowledge of their own eternal portion, but as a robot fashioned to serve. Close quote. And so that's how he summarizes the shift from the goddess to the god energy. And so perhaps we can just really talk about at this point how you see the goddess energy coming back into the culture. I think the time is critical, the timing is perfect, and this book is such a vessel. I have to say, of all the Campbell books I've read, it is perhaps even my favorite.
Oh, wow. Well, thank you for saying that, Duncan. That's a huge compliment. Well, I kind of look at it in different ways as to how it is that, these energies that we personify and have been personifying as goddesses are coming, into more and more obvious interaction in our lives now. I think, first and foremost, because of my work in the Jungian and archetypal psychology field, which is closely aligned to one of the main themes that Campbell talks about in the book, which is that the feminine principle we can understand as one definition of being transformation. And Campbell talks about the fact that these goddess mythologies and the rituals do show that people, through initiations, through ritual, through various practices, as is shown in that Odyssey chapter, which you and I talked about, and is my favorite. So anyone who's reading the book, I just, it's my favorite chapter in the book itself. What we're talking about is that the feminine principle, or the goddess, is she who helps us undergo transformation, not just into life as a human, and I mean this a little bit as a metaphor, but also our spiritual transformation, our psychological transformation. I think now, as has always been the case, but here we are trying to make sense of all of these various world political situations that are going on, communal situations, family. We, as individuals, are challenged today, as we have always been, to actually undergo our own psychological transformations. And I think that the feminine, the goddess, has everything to do with being able to undergo that. I mean, that was the heart of Jung's work, is, how do we undergo the transformation from being a child or passive or caught up in the collective story about what we should do, and come to find the true essence of our individuality. Well, as Campbell argues, that happens through the mysteries of the goddess. I just think that that's a huge part of the work that all of us are facing in our day-to-day lives. And as it happens on the individual level, it can then happen on the collective level. And so I think that's as important now as it's always been.
And I have to honor you again for the depth of the insights that you have brought to this work and so enriched it in how you've organized it and put it together. It's the great skill, as you said, of how to bring this through so that it becomes an opening for all of us. And we'll just end with Jung's famous comment that when we tap into the mysteries of the unconscious and fearlessly encounter them and deepen our historical knowledge of how we've come, as I mentioned, to where we are today, that resonance between the Marduk myth and Wall Street of today was just so striking and enriching and empowering to me when I read it, that if we bring this to consciousness, it gives us an empowerment so that we can choose our fate and make a transformation to our own benefit of the collective and also to this beautiful planet on which we reside. We can meet our economic crisis and our ecological crisis coming from our own inner balance of the masculine and the feminine. And as Jung famously said, if we don't do that, we will experience our life as fate rather than destiny. And so for having given this encouragement, which literally means enheartened value to this conversation, I want to just thank you very much and deeply from my heart, Saffron, for the wonderful work that you have done and you continue to do in this. And so, Saffron, I just want to thank you again very heartfully for the wonder of your work.
Thank you so much, Duncan, and thank you for your work and your living dialogues.
Beautiful. And with that, Saffron, I'll be diving back into the book, and that reminds me of Campbell saying that the most amazing example that he could think of in his long life and work of the masculine and feminine coming together was the great vision of Black Elk, the Lakota Sioux, who said, in my vision, I understood more than I saw more than I can say, but what I can say is I saw the hoop of my people and all peoples encircling the sacred mountain, and the sacred mountain was Mount Harney, which was locally for him and his tribe. But then he added the all-important words, Campbell said, but the sacred mountain is everywhere. So this image of the hoop and the mountain rising in the center is a great example of the bringing together of the masculine and the feminine, our KGNU family holding the space for the antennae to rise and to broadcast literally over our entire area and also now the world at kgnu.org. I'm Duncan Campbell. You're warmly invited to join us again on Living Dialogues. And if you'd like to listen freely to additional archived visionary dialogues with myself and other transformational thinkers, you can go to kgnu.org/living dialogues. That's living, DIALOGUES. And you can also Google Duncan Campbell, the best in new paradigm thinking. Thanks again for your deep listening in evoking this program. All the very best.